The single dad didn't expect the small red bicycle bell to follow him into that glass office tower. But months later, when the truth finally cracked open a powerful man's polished smile, that tiny bell would echo louder than any shout. And it all began with a trembling voice on a quiet afternoon in Brookdale Heights. The neighborhood was the kind that looked perfect from a distance. Rows of tidy lawns and painted fences stretching beneath a pale blue sky. The air carrying nothing more dramatic than the hum of sprinklers and the distant laughter of children just out of school. And Daniel Harper had chosen to live there for one simple reason: stability. Since his wife passed away 3 years earlier, stability had become his religion. He was 38, a remote accountant with careful habits and tired eyes, raising his 8-year-old daughter Lily alone in a house that still held too many echoes of a life that used to be full. On that particular Tuesday afternoon, he was walking home from the grocery store, a paper bag tucked under one arm, mentally calculating expenses the way he always did: mortgage, utilities, school supplies, the rising cost of milk, when he heard something that didn't belong on that street. "Sir, will you buy my bike?" The voice was small, uncertain, but it carried a weight that made Daniel stop mid-step. He turned and saw a boy standing near the corner of Maple Street and Ridge Avenue, where the polished sidewalks ended and an older duplex set slightly apart from the manicured homes. The boy couldn't have been more than 7. His brown hair fell into his eyes, his jacket was too thin for the sharp edge in the wind, and beside him stood a small red bicycle with chipped paint and one handlebar wrapped in fraying black tape. In his hands, he held a piece of cardboard with uneven letters drawn in blue marker. "For sale, $20. Daniel glanced around, half expecting a parent to be watching from a nearby porch, but there was no one. Just the boy, the bike, and a kind of quiet desperation that felt painfully familiar. "What's your name?" Daniel asked gently, setting his grocery bag down. "Evan," the boy replied, swallowing hard as if he'd been rehearsing this moment all day. "Are you selling your bike because you want a new one?" Daniel tried, hoping for a simpler explanation. Evan shook his head. "My mom won't be able to eat tonight," he said, the words tumbling out quickly before courage could disappear. "She says she's not hungry, but she is. She gave me the last noodles yesterday." The wind seemed to pause. Daniel felt something twist in his chest, something old and raw that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with memory. He remembered nights after his wife's hospital bills piled up, when he pretended he'd already eaten so Lily could have the last portion of soup. He remembered how pride can make a parent silent, and how love can make a child brave. "Where's your mom?" Daniel asked quietly. Evan pointed toward the faded duplex at the end of the block, its white paint peeling and one shutter hanging slightly crooked. "She's resting," he said. "She's tired a lot now." Daniel studied the bike more closely. It wasn't just scratched, it was cared for. The chain had been recently oiled. The tires, though worn, were properly inflated. This wasn't a child discarding a toy. This was a child giving up something he loved. "How long have you been out here?" Daniel asked. "Since after lunch," Evan admitted, shifting from foot to foot. "A lady said she'd call someone about me standing here, but no one came." Daniel's jaw tightened. In a neighborhood full of security cameras and neighborhood watch groups, a hungry child with a cardboard sign had become an inconvenience rather than a concern. He reached into his wallet and saw 2 20s and a 10. He hesitated only a second before pulling them out. "I'll buy it," he said, holding the bills toward Evan. The boy's eyes widened. "Really? Really? But you keep the bike?" Evan stared at him as if he hadn't heard correctly. "But you bought it." Daniel knelt so they were eye level. "Sometimes," he said softly, "buying something doesn't mean taking it away." Evan's fingers trembled as he accepted the money, and for a brief second, his composure cracked. "Thank you, sir," he whispered, voice breaking. Daniel picked up his grocery bag again, but didn't move. He couldn't. Not yet. Something about the boy's thin frame and practiced bravery told him this wasn't a one-day problem. "Would it be okay if I met your mom?" he asked. Evan hesitated, clearly unsure. "She doesn't like asking for help." Daniel nodded slowly. "Neither do I," he replied. "But sometimes help shows up anyway." After a long pause, Evan turned and led the way toward the duplex, the red bicycle rolling quietly beside him. The closer they got, the more the neighborhood's shine seemed to fade, as if the street itself drew an invisible line between comfort and struggle. Daniel noticed the small details: the cracked concrete steps, the rust near the mailbox, the window curtain pinned up where a rod had broken. Evan pushed the door open gently and called out, "Mom?" A faint voice answered from inside. Daniel stepped into a living room lit by a single lamp. The furniture was sparse: a worn couch, a coffee table with one uneven leg supported by a folded magazine, and a stack of unopened mail on the counter that separated the kitchen from the living space. On the couch sat a woman wrapped in a thin gray blanket. She looked no older than 32, but exhaustion had etched itself into her features. She tried to sit up straighter when she saw Daniel. "Evan," she said softly, a flicker of alarm crossing her face. "I told you not to bother people." "He didn't bother me," Daniel replied quickly. "He asked me a question." The woman looked embarrassed, then defensive, then tired all at once. "I'm sorry," she said. "We're managing." Daniel glanced at the nearly bare kitchen counter and the single can of soup beside the sink. He thought of Lily at home, likely finishing her homework at the dining table. He thought of how close he had once come to losing everything when hospital bills stacked higher than hope. And he felt something shift inside him, something that wasn't just sympathy, but recognition. "My name's Daniel," he said gently. "And I think maybe managing isn't the same as being okay." The woman hesitated, then nodded faintly as if too tired to argue. Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across Maple Street. But inside that small duplex, a different kind of story had just begun, one that Daniel couldn't yet see in full, one that would lead him back into a past he thought he'd left behind, and toward a man whose decisions had quietly dismantled more lives than anyone realized. But for now, in that quiet living room, it was just a single dad, a hungry mother, and a little boy who had been brave enough to try and sell his world for $20. The single dad didn't realize, as he sat in that dim living room across from a woman too proud to admit she was hungry, that the name about to leave her lips would drag him straight back into the worst betrayal of his life and expose the man who had taken everything from both of them. Sarah Mitchell, that was her name, kept apologizing, her fingers tightening around the edge of the gray blanket as if it were the only thing holding her together, while Evan hovered protectively near her side, still clutching the folded bills Daniel had given him as though they might disappear. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly, eyes avoiding his. "We'll figure it out." Daniel had heard those words before. He'd said them himself, sitting across from hospital administrators who slid invoices across cold desks while his wife lay upstairs fighting a battle she would not win. He knew the sound of someone pretending they weren't drowning. "When was the last time you ate?" he asked gently. Sarah hesitated just long enough for the truth to answer for her. "I'm fine," she whispered. Evan looked down. "She gave me the last noodles," he said softly, unable to protect the lie. Silence filled the room. Daniel stood and walked into the small kitchen without asking permission. The refrigerator held little more than a carton of milk and a bottle of mustard. The cabinets were nearly empty. He returned to the living room slowly, something heavier settling in his chest, not pity, but anger. Controlled. Focused. "What happened?" he asked. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, as if replaying a scene she wished she could erase. "I worked at Greenmart," she said. "Assistant shift manager. For years. Never late. Covered holidays. Trained new hires." Daniel nodded, familiar with the regional grocery chain that had expanded aggressively across the county. 3 months ago, they said the company was restructuring, cutting costs. I was let go with 1 week's severance. Her voice didn't shake when she said it. That was the part that hit hardest. She had moved beyond shock and into survival. "I asked for more time," she continued. "Just a month. I told them I was a single mom. They said decisions came from the regional director. Nothing they could do." Daniel's fingers tightened slightly against his knee. "Who's the regional director?" he asked, though something in him already sensed the answer. "Thomas Caldwell." The name landed like a physical blow. For a moment, the room seemed smaller, the air thinner. Daniel hadn't spoken that name aloud in years, but it had lived quietly in the back of his mind like a scar that never fully healed. Thomas Caldwell, his former partner, the man who had smiled across conference tables while quietly rewriting contracts behind Daniel's back. 5 years earlier, they had built a small financial consulting firm together from scratch. Daniel handled the numbers. Caldwell handled expansion. When profits began climbing, Caldwell restructured ownership without warning, leveraging technicalities and investor pressure to push Daniel out. At the time, Daniel had been too consumed with his wife's illness to fight. He sold his shares at a fraction of their value just to keep stability for Lily. He told himself walking away was strength. He hadn't realized Caldwell's appetite would only grow. He approved the layoffs personally, Sarah said, unaware of the storm building behind Daniel's calm expression. They said it came from his office. Bonuses were tied to quarterly savings. Daniel stood and paced once across the small room, then stopped himself. He didn't want to bring his past into her present. "Have you applied elsewhere?" he asked carefully. "Everywhere," she replied. "But when you're let go during a restructure, employers assume performance issues. I can't afford childcare for interviews that go nowhere." Evan looked up at Daniel then, hope flickering again. "Mom says it's temporary," he said. Daniel knelt in front of him. "It is," he said firmly, surprising himself with how certain he felt. He rose and turned back to Sarah. "Do you have any paperwork from your termination?" She frowned slightly. "I kept everything." She gestured toward the stack of unopened mail on the counter. "Why?" Daniel hesitated only a second. "Because sometimes numbers tell a different story than people do." That evening, after ensuring Sarah and Evan had groceries stocked and insisting, gently but firmly, that it wasn't charity, Daniel returned home with a quiet intensity Lily hadn't seen in a long time. After she went to bed, he sat at his dining table with his laptop open and began searching. Public filings, earnings reports, Green Mart's quarterly statements. He knew how companies disguise profit padding as operational efficiency. Within an hour, patterns began emerging. Layoffs coincided precisely with executive bonus increases. Community relief funds listed in press releases were barely reflected in actual disbursements. The numbers weren't illegal on the surface, but they were calculated, cold, strategic. The next day, Daniel reached out to two former colleagues who still had contacts inside regional retail finance. Casual conversations turned into careful confirmations. Yes, Caldwell had centralized termination approvals. Yes, bonuses had doubled. Yes, several single parents had been disproportionately affected because they were considered financially vulnerable and less likely to pursue legal recourse. That last phrase made Daniel's jaw clench. Financially vulnerable. As if that made them expendable. By the end of the week, Daniel's dining table was covered in printed reports, highlighted margins, and handwritten notes. He wasn't acting out of revenge. That surprised him most. Years ago, anger toward Caldwell had burned hot and reckless. This felt different. This felt precise. Focused. He thought of Evan standing on the sidewalk holding a cardboard sign. He thought of Lily asleep upstairs, safe, for now. And he realized something that unsettled him deeply. If a child had to sell his bicycle to compensate for a corporation's cost efficiency, then the system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. Caldwell had taken Daniel's company. He had taken Sarah's job. But what he had really taken was time. Time from children, time from families, time from parents forced to choose between dignity and survival. On Friday afternoon, Daniel made a call he had avoided for 5 years. He contacted Caldwell's office and requested a meeting. The assistant hesitated when she heard his name. "I'll see what Mr. Caldwell's availability is," she said carefully. 2 hours later, a confirmation email arrived. Monday, 10 a.m. Daniel closed his laptop slowly. Across town, Sarah was reheating canned soup for dinner, unaware that the man responsible for her hunger was about to face someone who finally had nothing left to lose. And on Maple Street, the small red bicycle leaned against the duplex wall, its paint chipped but its tires ready, waiting, like everything else, for the moment someone decided enough was enough. The single dad carried no anger in his hands when he walked into the glass tower on Monday morning. Only a small red bicycle bell in his coat pocket and a folder thick enough to collapse a reputation. And by the time he stepped back out into the sunlight, a powerful man would understand exactly what it felt like to hear consequences ringing in his ears. The lobby of Caldwell Regional offices gleamed with polished marble and quiet ambition, the kind of place designed to make ordinary people feel small. But Daniel Harper had once helped build rooms like this, and he refused to shrink inside one now. He gave his name at the front desk, ignored the flicker of recognition in the receptionist's eyes, and rode the elevator to the top floor where Thomas Caldwell waited behind a wall of glass and curated success. Caldwell stood as Daniel entered, smiling with the same rehearsed confidence he'd worn years ago. "Daniel," he said smoothly, "I heard you were doing independent consulting these days." Daniel didn't return the smile. He closed the office door behind him and took a seat without invitation. "I won't take much of your time," he said calmly. Caldwell leaned back in his chair. "Then let's not waste it." For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence stretched, not hostile, but heavy with history. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and placed the small red bicycle bell on the center of Caldwell's immaculate desk. It looked absurd there, sheet metal against polished mahogany. Caldwell frowned slightly. "What is this?" Daniel folded his hands. "That," he said evenly, "is what your last quarterly bonus sounds like." Caldwell's expression hardened just a fraction. "I'm not sure I follow." Daniel slid the thick folder across the desk. Inside were printed earnings reports, highlighted discrepancies, internal bonus allocations, termination timelines, and a summary of community relief funds that had been publicly announced but minimally distributed. Caldwell flipped through the pages with growing irritation. "If this is about your exit 5 years ago," he began. "It's not," Daniel interrupted, his voice steady. "This is about Sarah Mitchell. And Evan." Caldwell paused. The names meant nothing to him. That was the problem. "Assistant shift manager at Green Mart," Daniel continued. "Laid off during your restructuring initiative. Single mother. No severance extension. Termination approved directly from your office the same week executive bonuses doubled." Caldwell closed the folder. "Restructuring decisions are complex. You know that." Daniel nodded once. "I do. I also know how numbers hide intent." He leaned forward slightly. "You didn't just cut positions. You targeted the least legally risky employees, single parents without financial leverage. Your internal notes classify them as low escalation probability." Caldwell's jaw tightened. "Where did you get that?" "From people who are tired of watching kids pay for corporate optics." The room felt smaller now. Caldwell stood and walked toward the window overlooking downtown Brookdale, hands clasped behind his back. "Even if what you're implying were true," he said carefully, "none of this is illegal." Daniel remained seated. "I didn't say it was illegal." He reached forward and pressed the bicycle bell lightly. The small metallic ring cut sharply through the silence. "It's immoral." Caldwell turned slowly. "You don't get to walk into my office and lecture me about morality." Daniel rose then, not aggressively, but firmly. "A 7-year-old boy stood on Maple Street last Tuesday, trying to sell his bike for $20 so his mother could eat. That's the outcome of your efficiency." Caldwell's composure flickered. "Just briefly. I can't manage individual hardships," he replied. "I manage performance." Daniel met his eyes evenly. "Then let me manage something for you." He tapped the folder. "These documents show executive compensation rising in direct proportion to workforce reductions. They show community funds reallocated to administrative bonuses. They show patterns that journalists love." The word lingered in the air. Caldwell's gaze sharpened. "Are you threatening me?" "No," Daniel said calmly. "I'm offering you a choice." He walked around the desk, not to intimidate, but to close the distance between theory and consequence. You publicly reinstate the employees wrongfully cut during the last restructuring. You establish a legitimate hardship fund with transparent oversight. You correct the internal classification policies that treat single parents as expendable. Caldwell scoffed lightly. "And if I don't?" Daniel held his gaze without blinking. "Then the story becomes about a regional director who inflated bonuses by quietly targeting vulnerable families. And I promise you, that story will ring louder than this bell." Silence settled heavily between them. Caldwell returned to his chair slowly, flipping the folder open again, this time reading instead of dismissing. The confidence that once came effortlessly now required calculation. He understood numbers. He understood optics. And he understood risk. "You always did have a talent for leverage," Caldwell muttered. Daniel didn't respond. After several long minutes, Caldwell closed the folder and exhaled sharply. "If I were to review these terminations," he said carefully, "purely from a humanitarian standpoint," Daniel waited, "there may be room for corrective measures." Daniel nodded once. "Good." He picked up the bicycle bell and held it for a moment before placing it back down gently. "Because children shouldn't have to sell their joy to subsidize executive comfort." He turned and walked toward the door. "Daniel," Caldwell called after him. He paused but didn't turn around. "Why do this?" Caldwell asked. Daniel considered the question. "Because I'm a single dad," he said quietly. And I know exactly how close the edge can feel. He left without another word. 2 weeks later, Greenmart announced a renewed commitment to community responsibility. Several former employees were reinstated. A verified hardship assistance program was launched for single-parent households. Executive bonuses were voluntarily adjusted to fund transitional relief payments. The press release framed it as strategic realignment. No one mentioned Maple Street. No one mentioned a red bicycle. But on a mild Thursday afternoon, Evan rode that bicycle in uneven circles outside the duplex, laughing freely for the first time in months. Inside, Sarah folded her new employee paperwork with hands that trembled, not from hunger this time, but relief. When Daniel stopped by after work, Evan ran to him. "Mom got her job back," he shouted proudly. Sarah stepped onto the porch, eyes shining. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. Daniel looked at the boy racing past them, the late sun catching the chipped red paint. "Yeah," he replied gently. "I did. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with sirens or headlines. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the steady hands of a parent who refuses to let another child stand alone on a sidewalk with a cardboard sign. And somewhere, in a top-floor office overlooking Brookdale, a powerful man kept a small red bicycle bell in his desk drawer, a reminder that even the smallest sound can echo when it carries the weight of a child's hunger.